Our next presentation is an assurance update with Tom Barton, who is affiliated with Internet 2. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Jeanette. And I really enjoyed listening to all of the fellows just now. That was, it kind of reminds me, Hannah, I think if you're still online, you said it first, and I think best really, about the relationships. So in my own case, I started out my career as a mathematician. And so for the first 15 or so years of my career, I basically lived inside my head the whole time. No other people were in there with me, except the ones I made up, of course. And, but then I ended up being a CISO at the University of Chicago for quite a while. And it took me a long time between those two to learn that lesson. And I learned really quickly as the CISO with the first major incident that the biggest tool that we have isn't all the technology and so forth. It's the professional relationships that we and everyone on our team have and how far those extend across the institution, well outside of IT. And that's not unique to security. That's true for many things. And so just not to forget that all these policies and technologies and so forth are in the hands of people who choose what to do. And you generally want to help them do the right things and help you do what you need to do as well. Anyway, so I really appreciated those perspectives from the fellows. And I hope that they also will, in turn, go out and kind of extend professional networks further. Because the stronger and farther our networks reach, the more effective we can be and more problems we can solve and so forth. Anyway, so as I said, I'm retired. I didn't say I was retired. I'm retired, yay, from the University of Chicago. I still work some with Internet 2. I have for a very long time. And I work mostly with InCommon. I work with the REFEDs folks. You don't have to know what these are. REFEDs, well, I will tell you more. InCommon is the US Federation. And REFEDs is the international organization of all of the national federations around the world, and some other things. But I'm here to tell you about assurance, because a lot of what I do bears in this topic, and so I have a few things I'd like to let you know about so that you can be situationally aware. So here's kind of what's going on, what brings me here. First of all, what I mean by assurance? Well, there's two forms that I will address today. There's authentication assurance, which is kind of, or strong authentication. It basically boils down to multi-factor authentication. You know, how is it, well, so how confident are you that the bearer of a credential is the person to whom it was assigned? Right? And then identity assurance is really more about vetting their identity. Most often people think about this being done in terms of comparing to government-issued identity documents and stuff like that. But there's some variations on that I'll talk about in a second. So those are the kinds of assurance: authentication assurance, identity assurance. There's lots of other ways you can talk about assurance, but I'm going to focus on those two, and mostly on identity assurance. So why am I here talking about those? Well, it's that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have standards for identity assurance and authentication assurance, and the recent executive orders and other guidance issued by Office of Management and Budget has meant that all the federal agencies have to implement a lot more stuff from a security perspective than they used to have to do. And in particular, one of the outcomes when you chase it all through is that for most federal systems that have access to the public, MFA is required. And of course, that means that's becoming required because it takes them a very long time to implement things like this. And identity proofing is becoming required for federal information systems that are rated moderate, FISMA moderate systems. And so that includes a lot of the systems that we work with when there's sensitive human subjects data, most especially, like at the NIH. So that's interesting development and new. NSF grants management at the research.gov site, that's a FISMA low system. They are transitioning to require MFA per these federal mandates, okay? And I and a couple of colleagues from InCommon are working with them to help them understand how that can happen and to make sure that they can have federated access, federated accounts also be usable, continue to be usable at research.gov through that process. NIH has their grants management platform called ERA, likewise FISMA low. They have required MFA for all logins, with exceptions, of course, since a year ago, September, actually. And of course, NIH operates lots of other systems with sensitive human subjects data that are FISMA moderate. And so they're also looking at having to comply with its requirement to not only have MFA for them, but to include some kind of rather strong form of identity assurance. Okay? So we'll get into what that may mean, but the reason why I'm here to tell you about whatever it may mean is that this stuff tends to trickle down. Even if you're not a federal agency or associated with a federal information system, or even if you're not in the US, it trickles down. It can be through contracts. But I think more importantly, given that NIH, and in their realm, they're like the big gorilla if you're dealing with human health data. And so what they decide to do sets the level of practice. And if you're working with similar data and you're not doing that well, you're not being diligent. That's going to be the pressure to adopt that wherever you may be, inside the US federal government or outside, even far outside, even in the UA and that little island off the side called the UK. So here's what I'm going to say, which is this is for me, so I can remember what I'm here to say. First of all, if you happen to find yourself staring in the face of this need, there's a lot of tools already available. You don't have to do this from scratch. You can, but you don't need to, and you probably don't want to entirely. There's a growing number of commercial services out there that can do most of this kind of stuff for you. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. I also want to note that the NIST identity proofing standards that the FISMA moderate systems need to have and NIH will be implementing or will be required to justify against what they're doing aren't just using government-issued identity docs. Most of the time that's the case, and most of the time that's what people only think about. But the NIST standards actually have an alternative. Yesterday we talked about some situations with people that are underserved because they don't have mobile phones or they don't have the right kind of documents. And so likewise, the NIST standards also, I'm not sure if that was their purpose, but they can be used to address those circumstances where those may be absent, okay? And they're also usable in other circumstances where those may be very inconvenient, if not absent. I'll tell you about that in a second. Also, NIST isn't the only game in town. I mentioned REFEDS, the Research and Education Federations Group. They have an assurance framework called the REFEDS Assurance Framework. It has an identity assurance component to it. It's comprehensive. It's a good alternative in many cases to the NIST standards. And I'll say a little more about that. And in particular, the NIH, because they have such a large number of international extramural researchers, they have decided that they will accept the REFEDS Assurance Framework identity assurance claims in lieu of having a NIST IAL2 with FISMA moderate kind of assurance requirement. So they're going to be doing the NIST stuff for internal use and will accept REFEDS claims for external use. And the other thing I'll tell you about is that in common, and a little more broadly, in the Federation world, I'll give you some numbers about how many in-common organizations are known to be doing MFA well now, and how many are doing some of this identity assurance stuff, or at least have started on that journey. So why bother with insurance apart from the fact that someone tells you you might need to bother? So it's really, what is this about? What risk does it mitigate, right? These two forms of assurance. So if you operate a system of whatever sort, and you have to ask yourself, you rely on your own credentials that you issue to your users, or those that other people, federated credentials, so they come with them, and you allow them to be used to access your system. That's great. And the question is, what happens? What could go wrong with that? Maybe nothing. But what could go wrong if your system is accessed by someone who's not an authorized user using one of those credentials? So what could happen is that an unauthorized person has taken over control of an authorized credential. They've been phished, most likely, that kind of thing. And that's and you mitigate that risk with authentication assurance. You have MFA, so that if they're phished, they might get the password, but they don't get the second factor, that kind of a thing. You hope that's the case. You don't necessarily eliminate the risk, but you reduce it substantially. Likewise, you might have an unauthorized person being issued an authorized credential because they're presenting themselves to you in a fraudulent way. They're not who they say they are, that kind of thing. And identity proofing is meant to mitigate that risk. So the reason for doing this, the point, is there only to the extent that you really have some potential downside if an unauthorized person can access your system. As you can kind of see with NIH and sensitive data, that's a considerable downside for a lot of reasons I won't need to get into, but it's sensitive. And there can be lots of other reasons why you care. We talked a lot about operational technology, for example, yesterday. I know that LIGO, for example, from talking to some of their folks from years ago, they were extremely concerned about who could get on to operate the interferometers, okay? And so they had that separated, from everything else, from credentials on up. And I don't know if they still do, I bet they do. But those kinds of concerns are there. It doesn't have to be a regulatory basis for there being a big impact. It could just matter. You could just care for it a lot, right? So that's why it matters, or how much it matters, if it's going to matter to you because of that. Okay, so here's a complicated slide from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies about document-based identity proofing. It kind of looks like this. There's these three phases you go through. One, you have to kind of decide, well, what's the universe of identity documents that my identity vetting process is going to take as inputs? What are the possibilities? Driver's licenses, passports, other kinds of stuff, things from whatever it's going to be. And of course, NIST worries about US, people with US kinds of documents exclusively, frankly. So that's a bit of a limitation right there. You always need to be sure that they're chosen, that set, enough so that amongst all the universe of potential people that might show up in your system as a user, that you can distinguish amongst them with the set of identity documents that you are using in your process, okay? And they have to be kind of good enough, quality. We'll get to that in a minute, maybe. There's also the validation. You have to look at the evidence itself, and you want to know two things. Is this a bona fide piece of a document, or is it, is it a fraud, is it a fake? And so you tell with various ways. You can look them up, you can look at some built-in security features, you check that kind of stuff out. And then you also want to make sure, as a check against fakery, that the identity it represents exists in the world recently, that there's some other evidence. Maybe that person has shown up to pay a utility bill or something like that, right? And then you want to finally make the check. There's someone, a claimant, someone who's claiming to be this person, giving you these identity docs, and you're the registrar looking at this, and you want to make sure that that's actually the person that this identity doc is attesting to. And so that's the verification step. So those are the basic steps, and then how you do it gets a little complicated, but that's the basic idea. There's NIST and REFEDS, and there's also EIDAS, which is kind of a big deal in Europe in this space. And so these are kind of the big three identity proofing standards in the world, and there's some others. The IGTF has some stuff too, not specifically about identity proofing, but close enough, and they can be mapped into this scheme as well. IGTF, that was mentioned before, the Interoperable Global Trust Federation, of which the TAG PMA is a member. And they kind of align roughly like this. Each has 3 levels. They're named slightly differently. The lowest level is almost useless in all cases, well, at least for NIST and REFEDS, in terms of that risk. Is there a fraudulent person showing up to access your system? There is an IAL2 with NIST. It's actually quite substantial. There's like nothing, like you're a breathing bag of protoplasm, to we've done a lot of really serious vetting of you, okay, although there's more we could do. And then that's very much the same with EIDAS, basically. And the REFEDS standards, I should say, were developed with research in mind. It was in response to requirements that were voiced by a number of different research collaborations around the world a few years ago. And so the REFEDS assurance framework was meant to address them because these kind of government frameworks didn't fit well. Kind of like the story we talk about where we've got these government security frameworks that don't always fit well with open science. Likewise, the same flavor here. So the REFEDS has these 3 levels. that don't go as high as the highest levels that the governments need to worry about. We're not worried about researchers pressing a button that causes nuclear annihilation. We don't have to have that high a level. We only need to go as high as things like very sensitive human subjects and control systems for really expensive pieces of gear that we care a lot about. So REFED's high aligns almost with NIST's IAL2. It's sort of slightly weaker than, but basically there. Okay, is kind of how I'll put that. And then you can do both of those in remote settings where the user is working with a website and there's no other person doing the checking and so forth. It's possible to do that. I said, there's an eye chart. It's NIST's, not mine. I said that IAL2 is required for FISMA moderate federal information systems. That chart on that decision tree on the left proves it. If you want to have an idle moment sometime later on when you look at the slides. And I also said that there's an increasing number of commercially available services that can do that stuff for you. And I know that because I'm on they are all necessarily certified by the Kantara Initiative, which is the only organization that's recognized by the federal government for doing that kind of a thing. So either a federal auditor audits a federal service, or if it's not a federal service, it's the Kantara doing the same kind of a thing with these commercial service providers. And I said, for many years, I've been on their assurance review board, so it's just on top of that whole process. So we have insight into that, and it's published. There's a link. You can see who all's got those certifications and other details about them. And I can say that whatever that list is, there's like 8 or something on it now, and there's a number more in the pipeline. This has been growing over the past 2 years. There's been lots of interest, lots of commercial providers are seeing a business case for getting into this business. So they're detecting an increased need, partly in response to the feds, but many of them serve other industries, healthcare, travel, things like that. So also, Common members got together and developed a cookbook kind of a thing, guidelines oriented for US universities, but adoptable perhaps more widely, about how you can do this identity proofing stuff. So taking advantage of the kinds of processes that are typical on campuses, what can you do to build on them? And so that's also like this. So this is the help slide. If you need to be thinking about this, already, oh my gosh, 10 minutes. There's your help. So I talked about identity-based documents and an alternative that NIST recognizes, something they call trusted referees. Basically, it means that the right kind of person can vouch for you when as an alternative to having your own identity documents issued by the government and that kind of thing. And that can be a good fit for some research environments. You have a cyber infrastructure, you have allocations given to PIs through some competitive process. They're generally really well-known individuals, and they can tell you who's on their team, or they can tell you who will tell you who's all on their team. And those types of processes that exist currently for giving access can be leveraged to do IAL2 level identity proofing in a quite different way. So that could be something to take note of perhaps here. And that's something also recognized by the REFED's assurance framework in its upcoming version. It's being revised right now, and in about 6 months or so, that ought to be published. That's identity proofing, and I now want to kind of add in the federated access. How do you tell someone about it? So if University A identity proofs me, and I go to log into an NIH system, how can I tell them? So there's a claim that has been made, and that's over federation. So this is a quick one-slide primer on identity federations. You can see in common there, the top one that's kind of yellow, I guess. There's some numbers about how many organizations and identity providers where you log in from, and service providers where you log in to are in common and in the rest of the world. And down there, just to remind that what actually happens is that there is a transaction, an assertion made from an identity provider, the user's identity provider, to the service that the user is approaching, trying to log into, that first of all tells them, don't worry, they're authenticated, believe me, and there's reasons why they should because of how these federation things work. And then also there can be lots of other claims attached to that authentication credential that are statements that the identity provider says are true about this user. And amongst those claims are some of the claims from the REFED's assurance framework. And that addresses a variety of things, including, you can see identity assurance there in the middle. And they have those low, medium, and high assurance claims that I mentioned in that previous table, and another one called local enterprise, I'll get to in a second. And then there's also the multi-factor authentication protocol, which is of interest to us. So these are the bits of the REFEDS assurance framework that are the assurance, part of the assurance talk today. The MFL profile just says basically it's a way to standardize the communication between a relying party, a service provider, and an identity provider. Resource provider says, hey, I need MFA. Make it happen, or did it happen? And identity provider can say yes or no. And then there's some definition about what it means to say yes to an MFA request. So it's just to standardize the signaling. That was something that was absent for a while. REFEDS put a standard there. And then the identity assurance profiles, I mentioned the alignment of low, medium, and high with NIST and with EIDAS. And this local enterprise thing is completely different. It basically says, well, however we do it, hi, Vaughn, they're good enough, the people that we say that we have this claim, we make this claim for, can access some of our critical internal systems. So we think we're managing our risk well enough with them, however we do it, so maybe that's good enough for you. That's what that's for. NIH, where are they at with all this stuff? Again, a couple of colleagues from Incommon and I have been working with them for quite a while now. They have their Federation Gateway, which is called the NIH Login Service. They admit automatically all EduGain identity providers and all Incommon identity providers. So that's great. So as soon as one shows up in the EduGain metadata, boom, you're able to use that at the NIH. It supports the REFEDS MFA profile. It accepts the REFEDS assurance framework identity claims. And they are experimenting, I think this is interesting, this is no commitment, but they're experimenting with a step-up identity proofing process. They're recognizing that for organizations that don't do identity proofing already, which is most of them, it can be a big deal. They'll take it on and see it as potentially a big deal. They need to have a big deal business case to drive it. And for some institutions, their NIH investment will be big enough, and for others, maybe less so. And so it may take a little longer for some of those others to kind of come along, I think is roughly the idea. And so they're thinking about, geez, we don't want to have that stuff get in the way of getting our mission accomplished, getting all of our research work done. So we're going to look into a step up, and it's possible to do this, where they log in with a federated credential, don't have a REFEDS high claim associated with that, and then they can be shunted off to the side, go through one of these things with one of these commercial service providers, and get an IAL2 binding to that federated credential, and then they can go to town inside the NIH services. Maybe that'll work out, maybe not, we'll see. Okay, so they're doing the MFA now with ERA, and they slowly plan to add some of those moderate systems starting in 2023. They don't have a firm time frame for number one. We're getting to the end. But in 2023, they're going to make substantial progress on that. Here's a table. So NIH, between their login service and a compliance check tool they developed to help operators of identity providers know whether their REFEDS MFA is working, whether their REFEDS assurance claims are working. Between those two sets of data, up until just a couple weeks ago, this is how many by top-level domain, where people come from, have MFA, were supported, and had some evidence of identity assurance being supported at some level. So at that point, 186 higher eds in the US, and there's a few other organizations in the US and under some of those other top-level domains, were doing MFA successfully with an NIH. And that number has actually gone up by a couple dozen since I put this slide together. And there were 70 or so who had gotten some identity assurance claims working with the NIH. So that's not bad. For comparison, there's roughly, if you look at the top N funded list, awardee list from the NIH, down to the top 250 or so, get rid of the non-Incommon members, the non-higher eds, most of those are in this category. So those who get a lot of money from the NIH are paying a lot more attention and working faster to make this happen. So that's really what I had to say. I kind of wanted to come back and ask you guys, in your neck of the woods, what you do or what those around where you work do, how much does this matter to you? Do you do, so hands, do you have, so whether you do a system yourself or just pick one from your organization, do you require MFA? Hand up. Okay, a lot of you. Hands down. Other hand up if you do not. Some. Well, and there's some that do both. All right, all right. I know, David, that's okay. You and I are the sort that make things complicated. Why was MFA required? Someone just say. If you raised your hand for MFA required, what was the reason why? Professor lost their paycheck. That's what motivated the University of Chicago, precisely that, actually, when they did it years ago. A good reason. If not, why not, David?
So the reason I said both was because due to similar things. Also for several reasons of incidents that have happened which have pushed the use of MFA as well as government requirements for it, is the reason that we're using MFA more than we have, and there's a bigger push, in fact, particularly this morning as well. And where we are not is because we have multiple services, not all of which use the same authentication flow. And so there's a, the central set of authentication does use MFA, and we're looking at making that stronger, but we have lots of services which don't, so it's the long tail.
Okay, so it's sort of the least common denominator kind of a thing. If we have time for one more show of hands. Okay, I got an approval. So Martin, sorry, I'm not eating to your talk time a little bit. How about, now let's look at the identity proofing side of things. You want to make sure that whether the credential is MFA or not, that it was given to the right person. How confident are you that your users are the ones you think they are, that they're the right users? Hands up if you are confident. Only a few. Well, and if you're not really sure, at least in some cases, put your hands up. All right, that's more, I would say. So if you are confident that you know all of your users and they're the right ones all the time, on what basis do you stake that claim? Anybody?
Because they had access to their banking system, the payroll system. They can change where their paycheck goes.
So that because they can change where their paycheck goes, that makes you think that they're the right ones. Understood. Yeah, fair enough. How about if that could fail? Does that mean that there's nothing of great consequence that could happen if the wrong person accessed your system? Or is that just really you're kind of hoping that doesn't happen? Well, maybe it's time to cut me off with that answer so that people don't have to answer that question. Thanks very much.